There's no surprise that there is an abundance of LUTs nowadays, and because there's an abundance of LUTs, it's hard to figure out which LUTs are best for you and for your camera. And I know there's gonna be some people to say that you're not a real filmmaker unless you color grade everything from scratch and do everything yourself, but just like anything else, LUTs are just a tool to aid you in your filmmaking, help you create consistent and fast work. So the best LUTs that I've found to be used for my camera, which is a Sony FX3, so if you have that, these LUTs will be terrific for you to use, are the Phantom LUTs and the Danny Gewirtz LUTs. The Phantom LUTs are used to get my S-Log3 footage to a Rec 709 type looking footage, and the Danny Gewirtz LUTs are creative stylistic LUTs that I can put on top of that to get more stylized look. So I'm gonna jump on the computer right now and I'm gonna go pull up a clip and kind of show you the process of doing that, because if you're someone who just got these LUTs or are thinking about getting these LUTs, I think it's very important for you to understand that although these LUTs speed up your post-production side of things, there are still tweaks you got to do. And I'm gonna show you the little tweaks that I do, and hopefully will help you out to get the best out of your camera. So let's hop right into that. Alright, so now that I'm at my computer, you can see that I have 3 clips pulled up, and I'm gonna be working with this clip to show you what my process is. And the first thing I do is I grab an adjustment layer, and the adjustment layer helps me adjust things without affecting the clip itself. So it's very undestructive, because I can just delete the layer and everything I did gets deleted as well. I'm gonna create 3 just in case. I use 2 layers, but I just like having 1 extra just in case I need it. So I'm gonna be using the neutral LUT of the Phantom LUTs, the regular exposure, because I don't overexpose by 2 stops. I usually overexpose by +3 to 0.7, maybe sometimes 1 stop over, but I don't like going over that because you don't need to. So something you want to do is always have the Lumitri Scopes pulled up when you're working with color, because you can see what's going on. And the one I have is the Parade RGB. That's the one I like working with the most, because you can see the colors as well as the exposure. So I'm going to be using this to see what my colors are doing and what the LUT is doing. So you can see that it's adding a lot of contrast and saturation. And you can also see, now that the colors are pulled up, that there's a lot of blue in the highlights and the shadows. So the first thing I'm going to do to get this to a neutral look is I'm going to go to my color wheels and match, and I'm going to make sure that this clip is as neutral as possible, because it's going to be my first layer. It's going to be what's getting my S-Log3 to Rec 709, and I want that as neutral as possible so I can then go and apply my grade on top of that. Now that I have my color wheels and match pulled up, I'm going to pull up my highlights to make sure that these 3 are lined up, that the highlights are lined up. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Alright, so now that my highlights, you can see right here, kind of like the mid-tones, the highlights are still a little bit more in the blue, but because of the mountain in the back, you can adjust it more if you want to, but I like that the midtones are more neutral now. So now I'm going to go ahead and adjust my shadows, making sure my shadows are as neutral as possible as well. And there we go. You can see my shadows are a lot neutral now as well. And you could see that this footage looks a lot warmer than what it was. The reason why it looks a lot warmer is because it was very cold, and your eyes get adjusted to what it sees first. And because it was very cold, now the footage looks warm, but it's actually a lot neutral. Like it was very cold when it was shot. My white balance was just off, but now it looks a lot better. It's a lot neutral. You could see that there's colors playing in different situations. It's not just doesn't just look like a blue filter. You can actually see the differences in colors from the back and the middle ground, and everything just looks a lot better. It's neutral. And I also want to take advantage of my high dynamic range that this camera has, so I'm going to pull up my highlights and pull down the shadows, making sure that I get the most amount of contrast in this image so I can get the most out of my camera. I don't want to leave it flat. So what I'm going to do is go to my curves, and I'm going to get my black point, and I'm going to pull it down until it almost clips. Don't want it to clip, that's not the point, but I'm going to pull it down until it's almost clipping, and then maybe even pull up if I have to. And I'm going to do the same thing with my highlights. I'm going to go all the way up till it's clipping, and then pull it a little bit down right there. So you can see that it was clipping a bit, so I pulled it a little bit down so that my highlights are not clipping. And now you can see it's a lot brighter now. If I click it off, on and off, you can see that there's a lot more punch into it because I'm getting the most out of the colors, most out of my camera. If I didn't know too much about adjusting colors, and I would have just plugged in the LUT and I would have been like, dang, this LUT isn't as I thought it was gonna be. Like, I put it neutral but it came out blue, but it was because of my white balance. My camera settings weren't 100% correct. That's on me, but I know how to correct it, and that's the point of learning how to read your scopes, is being able to correct your little mistakes, right? So of course you want to shoot it perfectly, but that doesn't always happen. So being able to know how to adjust it in your scopes makes a huge difference. Before and after makes a huge difference. It looks great already. If I was working with a client and they didn't want something too contrasted, too much of a stylistic look to it, like a creative cinematic look, I can just add a little bit more contrast with my curves, kind of like that, making sure that I just get more contrast by doing a little S curve about there, and you can see that that adds a huge difference to the image, and it already gives it kind of a little stylistic look just because of how the phantom LUTs are formed, that it already has a great roll off in the highlights and shadows that you don't have to do too much to get a great looking image. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is add my stylistic look on top of that. And what I've been recently using is the Danny Gevirtz LUTs, which are different stylistic looks that he uses in his films. If you don't know who he is, he's an amazing cinematographer and YouTube creator on this platform, and I've learned a lot from him. But he did create this pack, and what I think is very interesting is that he uses a Sony FX3 as well. And he claims that these LUTs are for any camera, just as long as you're able to get your footage to a Rec 709 looking style, then you can plug these into any camera. But because he uses an FX3, that's an indicator to me that he's using, you know, footage like that in mind when creating these LUTs, which is always something to look into when you're creating LUTs. You want to make sure that the creator of the LUTs are thinking about your camera in mind. And because he made these LUTs using his FX3, I'm gonna go ahead and see if they're pretty good. Always keep an eye on your scopes because you can see what the changes are being made. So I'm gonna go ahead and add that blue and orange LUT, and you can see what it's doing. It's really pulling down the shadows and the highlights, really adding a little bit of that punch contrast that you do when you crush the shadows and just pull everything down. And what it's also doing is adding a little bit more blue and greens. You can see that those went up a little bit higher. Now it's not completely even. And you can also see in the shadows that the blue and the green went up. So you can see that now that it's adding a lot of that kind of coldness into the shadows and the highlights. So what I'm going to do is add a little bit more reds into my highlights and shadows, just a bit, so I can get rid of that blue and green because I don't want it 100% cold. There you go. You can see I didn't really adjust anything and it did a lot. And because I also overexposed by 0.3 to 0.7, when these LUTs crush down a bit more, you can see that I don't have to pull up anything, that because my black points are not really as crushed as it would have been if I was shooting at like perfect exposure right at a 0. And I don't have to shoot at 2 stops over because the phantom LUTs, you don't need to do that because he does provide the regular exposure LUT. So you can see just very fast you can get a very stylistic look that is very pleasing and is very cinematic, and I didn't really have to do too much. So obviously not every clip is going to be shot the same, so you're going to have to do those adjustments to make sure that you get that neutral Rec 709 look on the other clips. But I hope that helped just a little bit of how the process works. It's very important to get that Rec 709 as neutral as possible, that first base to Rec 709 looking very clean, because once you start adding that stylistic look to it, you're adding color in the shadows and the highlights or the midtones, you want to make sure you have a very clean base to start from, because if your color is already leaning towards the blue side or the warm side, it's going to be very hard to start adding a style to that because you don't know what the colors are doing or where it's leaning. But with those scopes, I can see that it was neutral, and then when I add the stylistic look on top of that, I can see that my shadows are getting cold or my highlights are getting cold. I can see what the colors are doing, what the stylistic LUT is doing to my footage, and then I can just adjust it to my preference. And it's very important to understand that grading is more about preference and color correcting is about getting it right. So when you're adjusting all these clips, like you have 3 different clips and you're color correcting, you want to make sure that you're getting all those looking as neutral as possible. And then color grading, it doesn't have to all look the same, just whatever serves the story and whatever purpose that you're providing for, you know, the film or whatever you're working on. That's more on you, what you want it to look like. So there's no right or wrong, there's just a little tweaks that you have to do to make sure that it doesn't look bad. But at the end of the day, if it serves a story, if it serves the purpose that it's supposed to serve, then it's not wrong. So I hope you got something out of that. I hope that you learned a little bit more. And if you didn't use scopes, I hope that encouraged you to use scopes. And I hope you check out those LUTs, because it makes color grading and correcting very fun and very easy. And I'm very happy I found these LUTs, because I'm going to be using them all the time, and I do use them all the time. So I hope you check them out, and I hope to see you next time.